the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest, we do want to mention briefly we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. If you like what we're doing, consider tossing us $1 a month there. We are very excited to host Brian Massumi on the podcast. He's translator of Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus, author of over a dozen books, including Parables for the Virtual, Onto Power, 99 Theses on the Revaluation of Value, Architectures of the Unforeseen, and of course today's topic of discussion, a forthcoming book, The Personality of Power, A Theory of Fascism for Anti-Fascist Life. First of all, Brian, Taylor and I would just like to extend a very machinic welcome, and we're just excited to dive into this book and hear what you have to share with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Brian, I mentioned to you this. I guess you and I, just a little bit of background. I'm just trying to think. I know that probably a dozen years ago, maybe I reached out to you randomly about Simondon. And I think that that's where our correspondence kind of went back and forth. And I was lucky enough to get, the chance to work on his dissertation or the primary one, at least. And I know that was kind of just helpful that you even deign to talk to someone who's just some random kid with these pie in the sky dreams, to do something like that had always been one of my goals, to translate a major work. And I do want to say you are one of my inspirations for even taking up the task of translating. But having said that, I have already told you this in private, so I don't want to belabor the point, but I do want to give you the chance to tell us a little bit more about yourself. We always find these anecdotes, these stories, these memories about the first encounters with philosophy, theory, that whole field. And so I want to give you the chance to begin us with anything that comes to mind about some of these first encounters that solidified the path that you've taken.
First, I want to say that it was quite courageous of you to leap into the translation of Simondon's work. I think you only do that when you don't actually realize what you're doing at the time and what it entailed. And I think from my experience with the A Thousand Plateaus, I think just the hubris of youth made me think I could do it. And I did it in order to, not just to translate the work, but I thought that it was a work that was really speaking to me, but there's a lot that I really could not understand. And I thought that by translating it, I would get an inside entry into the book and start understanding it from the inside out. So I think philosophy for me has always been an interest from very, very early on, even before teenage years, because I was living in a part of the United States, Phoenix, Arizona, that felt completely claustrophobic. It was in the very Goldwater years. It's extremely conservative. It was extremely oppressive from the point of view of gender and from the point of view of ethnicity. It was surrounded by right-wing culture that, of the time, often around precursor groups to what we see now in the alt-right. I just felt that there was no room to breathe, no room to move. And for some reason, I thought that philosophy would help me find those margins of movement. So I started reading as a kind of survival mechanism and doing philosophy. And for a long time, I didn't find the philosophy that really that really seemed to take me where I wanted to go, although I learned a great deal about it and it was very formative for a lot of opinions. But it wasn't until later when I discovered Merleau-Ponty that I found a philosophy that I thought that I could burrow into and that could unfurl into my life in ways that had enriched it and increased my abilities to observe, to perceive, to think, to act. But it was soon after that I encountered Deleuze and Guattari, and they took me on a sort of a post or non-phenomenological turn. And it was really Anti-Oedipus that did it. And I've been fascinated with the book ever since I first started reading it in the late 70s, and always felt that it was incredibly prescient in a lot of ways. That, for example, in relation to the theory of capitalism, that it was sort of foretelling the story of neoliberalism. And it had an analysis of capitalism in relation to fascism or fascistic tendencies that I personally don't think has dated. I think there are a lot of conceptual tools in the book that can still be mined for new orientations and new concepts. And reading alongside it, Deleuze's book on Nietzsche and philosophy became sort of foundational texts for me that for many years, when I wasn't necessarily actively reading them or citing them, they were still working in me and working through me, along with a lot of Guattari's own single writings. So when I came to Anti-Oedipus, it was a little bit by accident because I had actually approached Deleuze to translate Difference in Repetition.
Wow.
And he wrote back to me and said, don't do that book. It's too academic. We have a new one out called Mille Plateaux. I think you should do that one. He didn't know me.
That's amazing.
It was just this random letter. So that's what I did. I've never seen the two books working together and doing quite different things, but I've always read them. And I think they intended to read them as a couple. Right. They both bear the same subtitle of Capitalism and Schizophrenia. From there, when I was introduced to process philosophy and the work of Whitehead through Isabel Stengers in the 90s, that started creating a larger field of thought where there were very original conceptual systems that seemed to work together and create a broader consistency. So I started thinking in terms of process philosophy in an extended sense, not just Whitehead's version. It sort of spread out into a kind of field of thinkers, including James, Peirce, Simondon, and more recently, Suzanne Langer. So when I sat down to write about fascism, I thought I would go back to Anti-Oedipus and try to renew contact with the concepts that had really energized me at the time without my necessarily being able to completely understand them to begin with, and to replace that enthusiasm and sense of wonder in that larger field of the process thinking. That's sort of the conjunction that the book works through.
I love that notion of Deleuze completely downplaying his original contribution and just saying, no, that's academic, as he said, right? And focusing on Mille Plateaux. I love that's that story. It is interesting, the timeline of the translations. There is this interesting nonlinear publication dates of these, like Anti-Oedipus is one of the first. Nietzsche and Philosophy, as you mentioned, is one of the first to be translated, but we have to wait till 94 for Difference in Repetition to come out. And I guess that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that that's a wonderful story. I'm really glad to know that. And one of the things, go ahead.
I think it's important to also factor in that there were some partial translations earlier on, like translation of Reisman that came out from an Australian publication called Feral Publications quite early. And there was the interventions from semiotext starting in the 70s, kickstarted interest. And I don't think being academic is something that's necessarily something that's bad or that Deleuze would completely brush aside. Obviously, he said that what he did is philosophy, nothing but philosophy. He's very ingrained in the tradition of philosophy. But perhaps he was thinking more in terms of strategically what would be best for what would come out next of major works in the English-speaking world. Anti-Oedipus had given the impression to a lot of people who didn't know how to read it in its intellectual context and from the philosophical background it was working from, so that they had the impression that it was a book of free association and just sort of spontaneous exuberance, and that didn't have a conceptual consistency. Whereas, in fact, I think it has just as intricate and interlocking consistency of concepts as A Thousand Plateaus does.
I totally agree with that. And I can see how, when you look back at some of the scholarship coming out around at the end of the 70s and early 80s, that almost imitates Anti-Oedipus in a way that is not necessarily so flattering. I'm not naming names because I can't even think of one off the top of my head, but you can look back at some of that in the English-speaking world, that as you're saying, is a type of free association. It's a type of let's do schizophrenic writing or something, and I think that probably merits the timeline that you're saying, that getting A Thousand Plateaus out, you do see much more clearly that, as you said, it's got the same subtitle. It's meant to continue some of the themes and ideas. So I think that you're right. That actually makes sense why that would be a strategic publication of A Thousand Plateaus. One of the things that I really enjoyed throughout your work, and this is just off the top of my head because it's on topic of what we're discussing, was the very fact that you did go back to, you almost seem to privilege going back to Anti-Oedipus and mining through what we might term quasi-concepts, or these concepts that really didn't get fully fleshed out. You even mention in one of your footnotes that's very helpful, this notion of point signs, for example. But I'm also thinking of even something like machinic surplus value. These are sort of enigmatic concepts. I'm sure we could come up with a few other, but in Anti-Oedipus, they do show up, but they aren't given the kind of space, if you will, of, say, something like the body without organs, or which they return to in A Thousand Plateaus, obviously. So I really appreciated the fact that you, as you said, I like the way you described it. You went back to Anti-Oedipus with a kind of wonder. And I liked how you, the way I described it, and maybe this isn't fair to you, but I saw it as reprising and resuscitating some of these concepts that didn't really get a full life of their own. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about your process of concept creation and recreation, if you will? Because I think you do breathe new life into some of these terms and notions that honestly sometimes get left out of all of the concept creation that's going on in the 2 volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia.
That reception of Anti-Oedipus as being some kind of spontaneous outpouring put it in the realm of kind of spontaneous individualism. And it was criticized as not being political because of that. Part of why that is because a lot of those concepts that were not really attended to hold together a conceptual web that actually moves in completely different directions toward notions of the embeddedness of any individual in Simondon's terms, a pre-individual field, and the nesting of different levels of individuality or personhood within greater and lesser persons. What I wanted to do was to start from the present conjunction, taking the Trump phenomenon as a way in, as sort of exemplary of different kinds of dynamics that are coming to expression under a certain variation through Trump, but also connect to potentials that have expressed themselves in other forms in the past and will express themselves again in the future. So to read those potentials, read the tendencies running through the present moment in a way that allows maybe for a diagnostic view on different kinds of political tendencies, or in particular what I call fascistizing tendencies, Mm-hmm. So what I did, which is the same thing I've done with a lot of my work, is start from burrowing into the example and starting to play it from within, sort of move it around a bit and see what comes to what sort of floats to the surface, and then use that to problematize and then draw in concepts to respond to the problems. But the problems have been formulated in such a singular way because of their derivation from that singular example that there's no way of simply importing a concept in the way you might have already understood it. You have to reactivate it in the text. And sometimes some of the least noticed concepts seem to offer the most potential for that. There are certain concepts like point sign that is really underdeveloped in Deleuze and Guattari's thought. It came into their thought from Guattari. I haven't found many glossings of the concept. It's sort of dropped in every once in a while, but not integrated into the thinking in the same way a lot of the other concepts are. But it seemed to be something that could offer a key to bringing together a lot of the tendencies that I was talking about. So I decided to basically invent a concept of the point sign that was consistent with Deleuze and Guattari's thinking, but wasn't included in it, so that it would be sort of bringing to expression a kind of potential, a kind of tendency that they had started, a sort of a germinal concept in their work that's fully a part of it, but hadn't fully blossomed in the work, and then trying to bring it into its own. The conceptual menagerie that starts to weave through the book really comes from those little conjunctions where something was necessary to bring to expression a characteristic or tendency, but I didn't think was already developed in the literature on fascism, mainly because it had really taken the direction of theories of identification and transference between the leader as a kind of Freudian father figure and the individual as part of the masses who are deluded by that relationship and identification. So I tried to work bit by bit to create an alternative set of concepts that move away from that into a really different direction.
It's important because it does seem, and this was another kind of question that I had that's broad, but it feels again on topic, where it does feel like you are extending not just Deleuze and Guattari's work, but it does feel like a lot of the concepts are extending these lines. We already mentioned a few, but it does make sense now. I like that you say up front, obviously the title of your work could lead us to already have these misconceptions, these preconceptions, these preconceived notions of we're going to analyze the cult of personality, for example, as a phrase. You sort of upfront disestablish that notion as having the kind of value for the type of analyses that are needed, particularly if we are to, and this is just to throw all kind of terminology from Deleuze and Guattari, right? If we're going to say, as you mentioned, there's already been books and books written on a sort of molar conception of fascism, right? And that's where these theories of identification, transference, father figure, et cetera, would fit in fine. But if we want to explore a little bit more deeply these microfascisms, this sort of micrological level, as you describe it, then I think that it makes sense that we have to rethink personhood. We have to rethink this relation between collective individuals, collective persons, which you go in throughout the work. So I think that is why also, and this is another thing I appreciated, and I'm just sort of connecting the two now so you can respond, is you begin the work pretty boldly saying up front, this is a book of creation of concepts, right? This is a book of philosophy. And I think that putting your cards out on the table up front makes the reader aware. I think that even if that first chapter is going through the present conjuncture, as you stated, we are in for a wild ride that really ramps up as we move through parts 2 and onward with this conceptual creation. I didn't really necessarily have a question there, but I do think that was it that need to deepen the reflections on something like what Deleuze and Guattari call microfascism that sort of became the problematic behind the genesis of this work? Or maybe just tell us a little bit more about that genesis for this need of a different analysis.
Definitely the idea of microfascism and the necessity to integrate a micrological constitutive, micrological level that's understood as a constitutive level is what was motivating the work. I didn't think it worked to actually just integrate the micrological as a supplement to concepts of more molar forms of fascism that are still operating with the assumptions of a certain coherence of individual personhood with a mediation through identification among individuals and a kind of mesmerization of people as a mass, where it's so clear now that things are highly, highly differentiated. And as a sort of working in a normative fashion based on already existing norms, when there's definitely a post-normative aspect to what happens around Trump. Yes, so I wanted to work through the micrological. I realized that the logical part of the micrological was very important, and that it was necessary throughout the book to start creating positive tools for logic of what escapes the traditional logic of persons, categories, and sets that we've inherited in the Western philosophical tradition that has been critiqued very effectively many times, but that we seem to revert to habitually in a lot of our attempts to explain phenomena like fascism.
You know, I was thinking about this when I finished your work. Charles Stovall said something very enlightening where he said that, you know, rereading Anti-Oedipus, one should perhaps start with the last chapter and then go back to the first chapter. And one thing that I thought about just now as you're describing it, especially with the very fact that you state, I think quite convincingly, that logic is and always has been a political battleground. And so the postscript of your work lays out some of these logical distinctions, like real distinction, modal distinction, et cetera, that if I were to reread the work to get more out of, because I can't say I have fully ruminated all of the conceptual creations, right? But if I were to reread your work to try to get deeper into that, savoring those creations, I would start with the postscript and then maybe wrap around, maybe even dive into it like one is supposed to dive into A Thousand Plateaus, right? Play it like a record. There are some places that I know I need to revisit, but starting with the end and then wrapping back around, I think would be the way that I would probably approach it a second time through. Does that make sense to you?
It does. And I actually had, I don't know if the version I sent you had it, but I actually had a massive 100-page glossary at the end of it,
yes,
which probably will be taken out of the book, which was sort of meant to be that, a way of having a kind of random access, re-access to the book through certain concepts, and then a sort of system of relays between the concepts that would allow you to then go back into the book at certain points to find what was interesting you. The book itself, I think it's the only book of that size that I've written that is one continuous development. Most of my books are assemblages of essays. And this was written from page one as a continuous development. So
really?
I worked very hard to pause and introduce concepts and replace them in relation to each other as I moved along. And then by doing that, to be able to, rather than make a point and move on, to carry the conceptual vocabulary with me and then redeploy it throughout. Before we started recording, we were talking about how it was going to come out at Verso. In the end, they decided not to do it, even after it had been under contract and announced officially, right, because it was too complicated. And they didn't think their readers, because they're a trade press and not a university press, would be able to follow. I think what they're reacting to was this sort of snowballing accumulation of conceptual operators throughout the book. And that's what's most exciting to me, because it allows for a certain expansive dynamic where you have sort of nodes or concepts are coming together there in a very detailed way around a question. But at the same time, there's this web of concepts moving out from it in all directions. So my hope is that the reader would be able to, probably not the first, and not as the way in the first time, but after reading it once, could drop back in and have a sense of what that surrounding conceptual landscape is and be able to move through it in ways that are of interest to them and that they could perhaps extend past the book into their own thinking. So to try to create a little machine that hopefully helped others also create concepts. So it's not meant to be the last word on anything. It's not meant to be set in stone or set into an end form. It's meant to have a certain kind of dynamism that has conceptual play in it. And that can be difficult. There are times, as often happens in my writing, where the writing sort of swirls into a bit of a black hole because there's something that I can't quite work out in the context of this particular book, but it has to be there because it's holding the place of other concepts that could move there and at some level have to be there. It sort of creates a creative challenge, I hope, for the reader who's willing to swirl a bit in the black hole to be able to find their own way out of it.
Sometimes we get, I forget how it goes, but sometimes we fall into a black hole. Sometimes we bounce off the white wall. We have to work for those breakthroughs, right? The other thing that's interesting is the fact that it makes sense now, the snowball effect you're talking about. It does make sense. I wouldn't have guessed beforehand or even after reading that you wrote it in from start to finish, from page 1 to the end. I wouldn't have known that. And I do think that, I hope that Duke allows the glossary to be kept, because I do think that that's an indispensable, it's the toolbox. It helps one to get more out of the reading. But I do think that there is an interesting dynamic too in the writing that, again, reminds me a little bit of another way it extends Capitalism and Schizophrenia, not just in its analyses conceptually, but there is an affective dimension to the work that comes through at times. And it's not merely, again, because it discusses the present conjuncture or recent politics. I actually mean in the conceptual development of, and the thematics of the work and the problematics as it builds to an analysis of fascism. And obviously this notion of the affective, the affectivo emotive, right? Which is one of those Simondonian concepts that I love that you spent time deploying and working out. And along with your analyses of affect and through Spinoza, et cetera. But I guess I wanted to ask you if you had reflected on that affective dimension to the work, because obviously it's a work devoted to the creation of concepts, but it's not simply a textbook in that sense, right? It does have a dynamic that leads it, specifically even in some of the neologisms you create, one of which I'll ask you about in a minute. But I just wanted you to reflect, if you had, about some of that affective dynamic in the writing, because for me as a reader, I felt it. So I'm not sure if maybe you had thought about this.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, I think it's definitely there because the motivation for writing the book wasn't neutral. I've had a fascination with these characters, like Reagan, like George Bush II, and now it's Trump, that just seem to be so anathema to the way I would want the world to be and the way politics would be going. But at the same time, there's something affectively bracing about them. So one of the reviews for the book said that I probably wouldn't deny having fallen into the mesmerization, the fascination that Trump is able to create for his supporters, and to feel that, what Deleuze and Guattari call that miraculation of a preeminent body that is somehow shedding order-inducing signs throughout the social field in ways that orient it toward reaction. And it's true that I have that that fascination that makes it a compulsion to write about, but because I'm so resistant to the direction that it's going, and it puts me into an affective knot. So the writing, I think, carries a trace of that sort of emotive immersion, and the way that has to be affectively spun out as well as spun out in the conceptual content of the words, because a movement has to be made that broadens that into sort of effective paths of thought, indicating effective paths of re-perceiving differently and acting differently. So there's an affective work of trying to sort of expand what the thinking itself is coming out of and reconnect it to processes in the world that allow it to parallel them, but also to insert themselves back into it as you take what the book has done out of the book into everyday life, into your media consumption, into your perceptions around you as you go around the city. There's always an affective labor going on through the more reflective level of concepts. And Trump himself, I mean, the first thing you notice about him is that there is no rational order. There is no coherent ideological cast to what he does, that he's an affective operator. And his supporters don't express their adherence to the MAGA movement through an agreement with ideological concepts or even political program. A large number of them actually, if you go through Trump policies one by one, they'll disagree with them. But there's what I call an affective adjunction to the dynamic that he becomes a node of that draws them in, and in their diversity without homogenizing them into a mass, because there's a huge proliferation of different sub-communities, subcultures, different ways of adjoining oneself to the MAGA movement. And it's not a homogenization at all. It's a collective individuation, which is the correlated creation of individual takes on a dynamic, but with each take creating a variation on that dynamic so that they're correlated as part of a processual movement in the consistency of a certain field. But that field embraces a huge diversity. And Trump supporters' connection to Trump isn't identificatory in the sense that he's taken as a model or a norm of behavior. A lot of his supporters, especially the evangelical side, obviously have very little morally in common with the way Trump is in the world. I was just reading the poll in the exit polls from the South Carolina Republican primaries. Only 4% of the people who voted for Trump said they voted for him because of character. At the same time, his person is obviously key to everything. So they're not conforming their characters to him. They're not conforming their political ideology to them. They're falling into an affective movement with him where they feel that they're coming to their own uniqueness, that they feel that there's a kind of exceptionalism in the US that they take up in an individual form that has not been recognized or has been mocked by the so-called elites that they oppose, and that they're going to live out their exceptionalism. So what they're doing is in the stream of Trumpian dynamics, they're creating their own personal version of the exceptionalism that Trump exemplifies at the overall level. So it's a post-normative situation that allows for great variations in orientation and behavior with many transgressive elements to it. Because there are wings of the alt-right that are quite amoral or even anti-moral and anti-religious. And throughout, there's a kind of transgressive, what they see as a transgressive impulse toward wokeism or political correctness. But it means that you can't sort of draw a portrait of the figure of male patriarchal domination and list the characteristics that add up to that personality type, and then compare it to the characteristics of individuals who support that leader, and say that there's a kind of subjective resemblance that connects them to them through processes of identification. I was convinced from the very beginning nothing like that was going on, that Trump is post-normative. The political field he's working in is also, but it has poles of what I call normopathy, following Guattari, which is extreme, almost abnormal investment in those supposedly normal figures. So that by working the spectrum, there's a massive reproduction of fascistic, masculinist, racist positionings that don't coalesce into one movement or one form of ideology.
And I think that that's good that you brought up ideology, because there's a few things that came to mind as you were speaking that really resonated with me. So now three things with the ideology, but one was you have this argument, this phrasing that I really love. I think it ends maybe chapter 4 or part 4. I have to go back and look, but you talk about this notion of us re-becoming active in order to counteract a kind of becoming reactive in a sort of anti-becoming. That may be a mouthful, but I do think this notion of re-becoming active is really, really key. The second thing was the affective dimension to concept creation. You successfully, in my mind, sort of through this iteration of hyphenating, yoking together thinking, feeling. That is one of those refrains that really does help to solidify that notion of this affective dimension. And the third thing was I really liked this notion, and Deleuze and Guattari, even in Anti-Oedipus, they're already problematizing a notion like ideology. And then obviously in the second page, at least in the English edition of A Thousand Plateaus, they say there is no ideology, there never has been. Ideology, which is what we've been talking about, this level of identification and these other aspects that you've been describing. Ideology doesn't genetically get us to the movement and motion that pushes one to become reactive. It seems like an after image or an after effect, an epiphenomenon to sort of retroactively rationalize or justify those libidinal investments. And so I think that your description of a kind of corporeology, a kind of privileging of this body in motion and immersed in these milieus, I really thought that was a fantastic way of continuing this undermining of ideology in the work of Capitalism and Schizophrenia.
The way I have always understood the rejection of ideology is that in a complex field of emergence, which is working at a constitutive level, where what is happening does not have the same form or resemble what emerges from it, that ideological effects are created by non-ideological means. In other words, certain confluences and correlation of behavior and thinking emerge at a derivative level. And then the question is, what are the micrological processes that allow that to happen, that are sort of plugged into that field of emergent complexity, but are able to channel the tendencies that are stirring there into very, very predictable directions in spite of their massive diversity. So that was the problem. So the affective dimension, affect is one way to get back to that micrological level. Affect isn't the opposite of thought or even of rationality. It's a mode of thought. It's a mode of thought that's rooted in the body, in situation, in movement. There's a form of thinking that is flush with the affective feeling of the going on, the ongoing of the situation and the body's participation in it and the potential outcomes of that. So in Priss's work, he talks about abduction as being based in perceptual judgment. So he says that there's no clear dividing line between a perception and a thought, because every perception is, in a way, registering or assessing the movement it just came out of and anticipating the movement to come. So it's the feeling associated with a certain impingement or movement is always spanning a certain field, dynamic field, where the two ends are not actually existing or are not sensuously presented to the senses, because where this impingement and beginning of a new movement came from is already past, and where it's going is not yet. So they're really abstract dimensions, but they're dimensions of the body in situation. The affective dimension is sort of an abductive sense of how any particular juncture, any particular encounter is potentiating or depotentiating by opening or closing potential trajectories and sort of formatting a field of alternate unfoldings that are chosen among without a separate act of choice. So abduction is a kind of a logical assessment of the field of potential without a separate act of cogitation having been performed. So it's a thinking in the feeling, in the movement. It's a thinking feeling. And there's always the thought tenor of it, which is the embodied understanding of potential and alternative outcomes and of derivations, which is often very vague, but always there, that sense. The thought content is on that side. The feeling content is that every pulse of life, every pulse of process articulated, which happens at the articulation of an interruption or of an encounter, carries a certain overall feeling, what Daniel Stern, the psychologist, called the vitality affect, that envelops that thinking in a quality of life that is experienced. That's Deleuze and Guattari's synthesis of consummation or of consumption in Anti-Oedipus. So affect has those two dimensions of a kind of pure feeling that is enveloping an encounter in the field of relationality that it took place in, and a pure thinking, a thinking without a separate act of thought that's laying out potentials, sorting out aims, all of that happening together at the level of the body or as the body, because I think at this point you'd have to redefine the body as that thinking feeling in process rather than as a mass of matter that's somehow animated by a life dynamic or by thought. So the body, I hesitate to use the word materialism, sometimes I do, because those dimensions of real abstraction are so much a part of it, and there is no matter versus mentality dichotomy. There's always co-occurring complementary aspects of dimensions that you could generalize into matter or into mind, but they always come together as complements or processual complements of each other, more aspects or dimensions than different things, modes of activity that co-occur and work across each other.
This is part of that perception is thought. I had a whole series of reactions there that I could follow up on, but one of them that I wanted to ask you about earlier, and so I'm trying to remember it because I do think it fits onto what you've been discussing, was the very fact that you take up, for example, the term agencement, which you translate in A Thousand Plateaus as assemblage. But I like that you rework this yourself in this book as agencying in this kind of gerundive, active. What I like is that it is a way of kind of putting agencement in English in a processual manner, because it is related to some of these other things about it's not privileging the agent. If there is an agent, I forget how the James, what it is thinking or something like this, like it's raining, it's thinking. So
the thought is the thought is the thing he said.
Okay, yeah. And so I was thinking about this notion of kind of privileging process over something substantive like a subject or an agent doing the thinking, doing the agencying. The agencying itself is subject, if you will.
The translation of agencement by assemblage has troubled a lot of people. It's been criticized. I took it up from the earlier translations from Australia of Rhizome. I could not think of a better translation. I agree with the criticisms to the extent that thinking about an assemblage, you think about separate already existing constituted things, you put them together, and there's an interlinkage. So there's a kind of interactivity. But that's not relation in a process-oriented philosophy sense. It's not relation as Peirce thinks it. It's not relation as Whitehead or as Deleuze and Guattari think it, which we can get into later. Because relation doesn't start from constituted things. Relation is the field of immixing from which constituted things arise. So agencement in French, it has the etymological connection to agent and agency, but it has a very strong processual connotation that it's a working of it. And you're talking about the working of it, not the it. So the word agencying, actually I take up from Aaron Manning, who tried to grapple with this issue of what to call the assemblage. And I think it works. I think it gets the point across.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it would have been the best thing in the translation, but that's what I've been using since Aaron came to that suggestion. The idea of the agencement is that it's a subjectivity without a subject. It's not the opposite of subjectivity. And by subjectivity, they just in a very basic sense, something that is composed of a number of sub-activities where as a whole, that are correlated toward certain directions that catalyze into a movement that's oriented toward aims. And the aims, so there's a certain kind of finalism involved, but it's more like Rier's neo-finalism, where there's a vector-oriented movement toward what I call an attractor state coming out of chaos theory, which is a virtual pole, in a sense, magnetizing a field of activity in a way that pulls certain activities to it. So it's a final cause in the sense that it's pulling things toward it from the future, but it doesn't have a form that's predefined. It's not a form. It's not a content. It's just that. It's what Whitehead calls a lure. It's an attraction. It's a magnetizer of dynamic direction. So the agencement is a kind of jigging into form of a number of elements such that they create a consistency of movement, and that, in a sense, is reassessing itself as it moves because it's able to integrate impingements that happens along the way into its self-constitution, and it's able to revise its aims. It's able to invent new aims. Whitehead's philosophy goes into this in a lot of detail in his theories of the actual occasion as oriented by what he calls the prehension of eternal objects or relational potentials. So it's a subjectivity without a subject that's more self-catalytic and has a vector quality. And the vector quality has a feeling, a kind of vitality affect attached to it. And the sub-elements are not formed elements. They're what Langer calls act-likes. They're not actions. They're of the nature of activity, but they're not formed activity. They're stirrings where already they seem to be calling toward an aim and an aim seems to be calling toward them before they even start unfolding. So potential is not neutral. Potential is always in some way oriented already. And then it trips into an unfolding where it takes advantage of encounters or impingements to use them as what I call genetic elements, as formative factors of itself. So Langer, in her book Mind, Volume 1, has a really interesting discussion of the difference between action and act, and the difference between material and element. So an action is sort of a set of already formed interlinkages of action that are oriented toward a use or function, where you can say that there is a sort of a finality that's already pre-inscribed in it, in terms of function and maybe with varying content, but always with a complementary content that's also already formed. But the act is just what James called the something doing. It's what I call bare activity. It's sort of a bundle of activity already under the force of a lure or an attractor, but not yet separated out from others. So it's a tendency that's bundled with other tendencies. And what that does is give you a basis for the thinking that's not substance-oriented or ideologically oriented and having some kind of ideational or substratum to it. Because there's nothing but activity and activity upon activity. And the elements are these little act-likes, these little points of their activity that are sort of jumping around like electrons waiting to attach themselves into an atom, or just thinking in terms of tendencies that are as yet unformed but have a certain orientation and a tendency to express a tendency, to take on a tendency, to take form in order to settle that tendency in the world in a lasting way. So the material for Langer is at a different level. It's what enters into function. It's what enters into action. And the elements are those elements of activity, the act-likes, that have a completely different ontological status. So they're not subject. So they are subjectivities without a subject that are already in pre-movement, or what Aaron calls pre-acceleration, and are tending to express themselves by taking on a certain form. You no longer have, at this point, to remain in that thinking, you have to get rid of the substance predicate logic, the idea that what the world is made up of is substances that can be predicated with certain properties, and then those properties cohere into a way that can define a category, and then that category can be used as a triage mechanism to identify, by resemblance, elements that would fall under its umbrella. That's what I call the merely abstract, as opposed to the really abstract. And it's a level of general abstract ideas that I, through the book, show how they function actually to magnify error in ways that goes off the track into conspiracy thinking. So that conspiracy thinking isn't a lack of logic or a lack of rationality or intellectuality, but it's actually an extreme intellectuality that's taken off on the wrong track and has been motivated through its following tendencies that are reactionary tendencies. So there has to be a whole other development to talk about what reaction is.
I'm really glad that you were able to go back through some of this, because it helps to crystallize a lot of the ideas throughout the work. It helps to bring into focus a lot of the work that you go into throughout the book. And so I guess I would say, I think that assemblage works well in the translation, but for this conceptual line of flight that you're going on, I do appreciate this notion. And yes, it may be a little bit more awkward than assemblage, but Deleuze and Guattari and What is Philosophy talk about some neologisms require a certain barbaric nature, right? He even talks about deterritorialization as like, it's not a pretty word, it's not easy to say, but it has a logic to it. And so I think that I appreciated you being able to run with that. I've talked about this before, like what's another way of translating it? It could be arrangement, but even that really only hints.
That was also an early.
Yeah, that was
also an early translation I decided not to use. Yeah.
I think that it's appropriate for your work to deepen this notion, because it gives a whole new spin on something like collective assemblage of enunciation. That plugging in agency, or at least having that in mind, already gets us thinking down a track that, again, this is your discussion of errors. There's a little error that was, said in there, but that's not necessarily somehow opposed to what's correct or true, right? As you work out through Spinoza and the imagination towards the end of your book.
I think we really should respect and resuscitate jargon. Whitehead says that the job of philosophy is to move beyond the commonplaces of ordinary language and to create concepts that require the creation of new language, and then to set that new language into a usage that allows thinking to expand with it. So I get very impatient with notions of jargon as if it's something that's just obscuring, and that I have the sense that people are saying, well, just give me something that I've already thought so I can recognize it. And I'm not going to be too strenuously challenged by the reading. And I'm not necessarily going to be challenged in the way I've encapsulated things in the past. That's refusing to leave that level of already established general ideas or of common sense, which operates in the same logical form. I take accusations of jargon as a compliment, but obviously there has to be a real work in the writing to make every step in the introduction of the jargon motivated by the writing, making sense in the context, not necessarily in a way that the reader can understand all of the implications at once, but enough that they understand enough of the implications at that moment to feel that they're not impeded going to the next passage.
I agree with that.
So resuscitating jargon has a certain kind of responsibility toward the reader involved with it.
I think it's in the rhizome plateau where they even call something, I think they call mathematics a monster slang. And in this context, one could see that as an accusation or a disparagement. But in the context that you're bringing it up, it actually is just another field of continuous variation and shouldn't be measured by a standard language, right? That's obviously one of the main concepts that recurs throughout the work is this notion of the standard, of a major mode as the means by which to anchor ourselves. It's kind of like anchoring ourselves in opinion, as Deleuze and Guattari. Opinion helps us to ward off chaos, but in the same way that a major mode, a standardized way of speaking might. But in order to create problems or to investigate further, we have to be willing to let go of that.
Slang is really imbuing language with a style, and it's working through the conventions of language to distort or extend them in ways that create new expressive possibilities. And there's sort of a common sense idea of philosophy where you have these ideas and then you write them in words in order to put them on the page and communicate to someone else, as if the concepts existed outside the writing or of the speaking of them. There's no concept that exists outside of the particular expression of it. So you're always fashioning, in writing, you're fashioning concepts. And I think that philosophy, the way I understand it, is really a practice of writing, and that should be taken very seriously.
And we should also remember that philosophy's function is not to necessarily be a mode of communication in the general sense in which they critique this notion, right? That philosophy would be informational, communicational, all these other commonplace notions that really reduces the ambit in which philosophy moves.
I think philosophy should be the practice of preparing the ground and dropping germs of thought in the ground so that they can grow into new plants. So that's how I'm not communicating to my readers. And if I was communicating with them, I'd have an image of who they were and what they needed before. But those images are usually just taken from already existing categories, or basically marketing categories, or orientations that have already arrived at too general an expression to be useful. So I think the part of taking writing seriously is not having a concept of the audience you're writing to. Like Deleuze says, in politics, it's about a people to come. And I think writing philosophy is about an audience to come. It may never come, and you may fall into total irrelevance. But if it does come, then it's availing itself of potentials that you've seeded that continue a thought dynamic through its trajectory in the world in a way that creates new variations on it. So it becomes a creative act. And that's part of why Deleuze says that creation of that producing concepts is a creative act.
You make this clear too. It becomes clear in your work, and it's something we discussed earlier about the affective dimension in the writing, insofar as, and it comes clear in your discussion of Spinoza in the postscript, where as though there were some sort of mode that would be true thinking and rationality imbued by reflection. Whereas you argue, and I really like this, in order to sort of counter these reactionary tendencies, we have to have non-rational modes of thinking, which doesn't mean irrational in any sort of commonplace sense, right? But this mode in which, and I think this gets us back, maybe this was what you wanted to respond to, this notion of the major mode, the standardized mode of thinking. For example, as you work through the man standard, which again, I think that there is this notion, for example, I remember being struck in my first reading of A Thousand Plateaus when I think it's in the faciality plateau, where they work through, the face of Christ as sort of the white European male. You can list out the major mode, and of course they're saying there is no becoming major, there is no becoming man insofar as man is taken as the standard. But one of the ways that they wrap this notion around is this notion of racism being not necessarily based on otherness, but on this radiation of waves of sameness, I think is how you render it. And it's that notion of a standard mode, whether it be in language or in, obviously, which has political dimensions, as we know from the postulates of the linguistics plateau. But in any case, you're working through the man standard throughout the work, I thought was a great point to be able to anchor myself. Times when I felt like I was getting lost, I was able to sometimes retrace back to these slightly more familiar concepts. So I guess familiarity isn't the worst thing in the world, because sometimes we don't de-stratify quickly, as I always say. But yeah, I guess this notion of whether we think about it in terms of the majoritarian or in terms of, as you work it through, as the man standard, which I love that you connect this notion for Deleuze and Guattari that there's only one gender, as in Anti-Oedipus, there's only one class. I just wanted to give us a chance maybe to talk about notions of standardization, because we've kind of talked about other aspects of the molar mode, whether it be identification or these received notions of substantial individuals, etc. I guess this question of the minor politics that infuses your work, we can maybe touch on for a minute.
Yeah, the man standard is something I wrote about at length in my very first book, User's Guide. It always puzzled me that people still and increasingly say that Deleuze and Guattari have no interest in or theory of gender or race, because I saw it throughout right. their work. And it crystallizes most around the concept of the man standard, which in contemporary vocabulary you could talk about as whiteness or as neurotypicality. The man standard, paradoxically, is a generative matrix for non-standard variation as well at the very same time. The way they think about the man standard and the reason why they say that it is, I forgot what I was going to say, but the way they talk about the man standard, the way they say that there's only one gender, is that there's a kind of preeminent term that's defined, which was originally defined as the bourgeois patriarchal male, or as they say, a white European speaking a major language and having a certain level of affluence. And then there's certain characteristics that are imbued in that standard as a category that is at the pinnacle of a hierarchy that male bodies, are meant to aspire to and conform to. But in order to hold that up, there has to be contrasting identities. So because it's a standard, basically of whiteness and of bourgeois blandness, there's not much holding it up on itself. You can't become man because it's empty. The less valued terms that contrast with it are a constitutive part of what holds it up. So the man can define himself in opposition to the woman with another set of attributed qualities that are the opposite of what are desired from the male dominance perspective. And then there are other categories of the child, or the minor in that usual sense, or the animal. And there's a funny little diagram in a footnote to A Thousand Plateaus where they draw this out. It's like a three-dimensional crystal, and each vertex is one of these categories, and then man is at the top. And man is understood from the humanist. It's understood from the humanist European perspective through the history of colonization, moving into the consolidation of the nation state, the miniaturization of sovereignty in the individual, where the father becomes the king of the home as the castle. There's a kind of creating of analogous levels, basically coming out of a secularization of monarchic concepts of hierarchy and preeminent value. The problem is that first of all, the opposing categories, the rigidity and emptiness of the man standard of that vertex, is when it attributes these opposite, sort of other qualities to the woman or the child or the animal. They're qualities that don't have that rigidity. They're qualities that are often thought of as having a lack of organizational integrity, like all of the stereotypes of women being flighty, or metaphors of flow based on menstrual fluid, all those kinds of stereotypical associations that come in. But the fact is that they're less rigidly left in place. So there's a kind of leakage that's starting already out of that one gender that is man as a vertex of undervalued, dominated subvertices. And that flow out of the man's standard is constitutive of it, because it's an unintended effect of the way it has to recruit other modes of being to shore up its own, and it has to vampirize their energies because of its own emptiness, depending on them for labor, for food, for any number of material, as well as subjective services and emotional services. So part of the man standard is this, there's already built into it the beginnings of a deterritorialization of it, or a becoming minor of it. And we've seen that through in the last 40 years or so, where a previously undervalued term will revalue itself and affirm a certain identity category for itself, in opposition to the domination of the man, but also the man standard. But it falls back into it to the extent to which it creates its distinction on the basis of an identity category, because the exact same slippage is going to happen within that identity category. So you've seen that kind of slippage where there's this proliferation, creation of new variations that expresses itself in new letters being added to LGB, going in almost an endless variety of them. So there's a field of proliferation of modes of existence that are affirming themselves in escape from that, but also reinscribing themselves in it to the extent that they have to figure themselves recognizable categories, recognizable identities, in order to have a foothold in the structures of power that exist. So there's a kind of double wager going on, that you can create a variation on a man's standard in order to reaffirm and revalue devalued terms, without then becoming the revalued term becoming oppressive of another emergent term that very gesture has opened, in many ways, opened the way for. So the classic example I come back to a couple times is the example of transphobic feminism, where the trans modes of life have become much more successful at affirming themselves and finding a place in the world for themselves. But they become oppositional to identities that have accommodated themselves to the man standard. So there's a pull of deterritorialization, proliferation of difference, which I like to call speciation. It's kind of engendering and creation of proliferation of genders. But each gender, if you're not thinking about it as a category, a general category, as an identity, umbrella identity term, it's a sui generis species. It's a kind of its own, self-defining, self-catalyzing, self-affirming. But so on one hand, is a movement out of the man standard, out of general categories, out of identity, into a proliferation of modes of life, where it's no longer possible to create strict boundary lines between them, so that there's resonations and sort of creative synergies among the variations. On the other side, there's the man standard as this empty bourgeois standard of rectitude. Both poles continue to be operative, so that there's a field, and then there's a field of oscillation among it, along it. And very strange variations can happen, where, I talk about this concept of ornamental masculinity that comes from the feminist commentator Susan Faludi. Picked up on a lot of commentary, mockery about Trump, saying that the last thing he is the image of a strong, upright, right-thinking bourgeois patron of in the 19th century mold. He transgresses the norms. His speech does not have logical coherency. His actions sometimes seem to be stochastic, like he's just throwing out things to see what the effect would be. There's no overall coherency in what he's doing. And in that overall lack of coherency, he's integrating into his persona elements of what traditionally are coded as feminine. So Faludi was talking about the sort of the catty girl aspect of Trump, this sort of emphasis on a sartorial and this kind of ornamental presentation of self in an ornamental, highly ornamentalized context like Mar-a-Lago. So I never thought that he embodied the male stereotypical normative prototype, but he has extreme normopathic tendencies of rigidification and aggression toward the other. But then he's embodying part of that spectrum in himself so that supporters don't have to identify with him. They just have to move with him onto the spectrum. And then oriented by reaction, they move in ways correlated with his movements and with each other. That notion of ornamental masculinity, I think Faludi got from feminist sociology of gender and a concept that's been created over the last 20 years of hybrid masculinities, which have been used in very interesting ways to talk about incel culture, geek culture, online, what they call the manosphere, online masculinist culture, where a lot of aspects of that are really playing between masculine and feminine stereotypical properties and exploiting that movement between them. So a figure like Andrew Tate, who, in sort of one aspect, is just the perfect man standard, the extreme male dominance figure. At the same time, his supporters think about themselves as lacking in relation to him as an ideal, and as never being able to live up to that, just like an incel thinks they could never live up to the image of a Chad. Mm-hmm. They don't have the attractiveness, they don't have the eloquence, they don't have the strength, they don't have the fortitude. So Andrew Tate will make himself vulnerable in order to become a kind of spiritual guide or psychological guide for his male followers who feel that they haven't been given their due by society and haven't been able to rise to the position partially because of what they see as feminist anti-male aggression, but also because they don't have it in their own constitution to do that. So they affirm different varieties of masculinity, and they give names to them. The alpha masculinity is the Chad, or the dominant male. There's beta, there's zeta, there's a whole series of different masculinities that have different relationships to the traditional norms and have different levels of transgressive behavior towards societal norms. So there's this whole spectrum of behavior that isn't organized by the norm, but is organized in an oscillation with the norm, and that amplifies certain reactive tendencies in ways that push it beyond the norm into behavior that just a few years ago would have thought it was totally beyond the pale. So that they're able to subjectify new variations within a male dominance dynamic without living up to the upright notion of the strong male. That whole dynamic has been really interesting to me, that there's in a sense, there's a becoming of men that's not a becoming man. It's a becoming hybrid. Hybrid's not really the right word, but it's a becoming more or less non-normative variations on a man standard. Foucault makes the distinction between normalization and normation. And in the older assemblage that the man standard came out of, there was a set of norms that formed content to themselves and that were definable and created categorical boundaries around themselves that stood as identities. But there is no norm in that sense anymore. I mean, there is, but it's not all there is in the field. The top of the curve of normality is no longer where all of the action is, and everything is not moving toward it. It's like the curve of the bell curve oscillates between poles, and people are able to insert themselves into that oscillation, and they become affectively adjoined to the processes that are enabling that oscillation, enabling them to insert themselves in it. And that kind of affective adjunction, affective adjoining of a life dynamic to a sort of a certain field of relation with its own dynamics and orientations that allow people to express themselves and come to the concept of themselves as an individual is the replacement that I've tried to develop for theories of identification, so that, again, identificatory effects are created by non-identificatory means, and there is no the foundation is moving. And because of that, it's highly powerful. It's highly virulent because it can leave its opponents in the dust by its own movements of variation. It can always move on to another variation on itself. It's very hard to pin down and to capture. And one of the things that motivated this whole book is that throughout most of my life, I really thought of the right wing as lacking in creativity, lacking in conceptual innovations, lacking in art that seemed to be expressing what was happening. And all that changed with internet culture. There's a very, very vivacious creative culture of creation of memes and images and new words and slang coming out of the alt-right. So the first time in my life over the last few years, I've seen this cultural vitality on the right that really scares me, because it's completely given over to reaction and to rejection of, hatred of, and aggression toward the other.
I like how you unpack that notion of the man standard, and it actually enlightened me on there's two lines that I thought of, and it's from the Micropolitics and Segmentarity Plateau. I'll just read them because I think it the first line says, the stronger the molar organization is, the more it induces a molecularization of its own elements, relations, and elementary apparatuses. And then on the next page, they follow that up with, this is the insight that helped to really crystallize in my mind what they mean by this when they say power centers are defined much more by what escapes them or by their impotence than by their zones of power. And I think that your way of unpacking the man standard, as you just did, really brings to light that notion of it's what escapes that sort of defines them more so than any sort of substantial basis. I think that you brought out that notion very, very well, and it helps to sort of breathe life into why perhaps we have seen a certain backlash against more the sort of, I guess, the past decade, but even more so. But we can think about the rise and reaction, this backlash against what is allowed to escape, what is allowed to leak, right, from these zones of power. There is a kind of reaction against that to try to sort of almost like plug the and I know you use this image where you're sort of trying to dam the walls, right? You're trying to dam the flows from escaping, that being the where to look instead of any sort of self-consistent identity. That's very powerful.
That's very, very much what I was trying to develop and taking off from. And for a long time, earlier in my own thinking, and I think in a lot of people's thinking, that escape was equated with the left, with revolutionary potential. What's scary to me now is that the right has that same movement of escape, which means that it does have a revolutionary potential. So you have parts of the mega spectrum, like the Boogaloo Boys, parts of the Proud Boys, groups like that are explicitly anti-normative, that mock the Christian right, and that don't have the same kind of allegiance to Trump personally, but have joined themselves to this process of becoming reactionary, that could actually overflow the control of the Republican Party or of right-wing think tanks and the sort of that whole sphere of right-wing thought and activism. So there's a kind of becoming minor on the right. So that major minor is not a political designation of right and left, is a designation of affirmative and reactive. And on the reactive side, there's this movement and that's where microfascism is found, where you could potentially spin off power centers around figures, local figures, which happens in right-wing militia movements and things like that, where there's a kind of mini Trump defined in various ways, where there's a kind of orbiting around the organizing and disorganizing oscillations in the orbit around this face, the system of faciality. And microfascism occurs when there's a proliferating spin-off of these power centers that can no longer be centrally subsumed and controlled, and they become a cancerous growth in the social body. Every fascist regime has to accommodate themselves to them. They have to bring them back into itself, which the Nazis did in the form of the stormtroopers coming out of the 19-teens and 20s militias, like the Freikorps, that Teva Light writes about in his book Male Fantasies. So that there's this inbred tension between the centralizing tendencies and the deterritorializing tendencies. And I adopt this term of fascism from Umberto Eco, which reminded me of the concept of the state in A Thousand Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus, to try to designate this attractor pole, which comes from the cooperation to the extreme of both of those tendencies at the same time. So a centripetal tendency to draw all energies into the center and to organize that into laminar flows, to shore up the power that is occupied by a preeminent person who functions in a mode that Deleuze and Guattari call faciality. But at the same time, the more intense that becomes, the more the deterritorializing tendencies start to jostle, and it creates this unbearable tension. So you saw that in Nazi Germany with the consolidation of the German nation under an authoritarian becoming totalitarian regime. But at the same time, this incredible that they finding channels for the outlet of the deterritorializing tendencies and the attack against other bodies, foreign bodies within the nation and the outside of the nation, because you can't have a completely rigidified, self-consistent whole nation when there's a space outside the nation that doesn't subsume. So by nature, structurally, it's threatened by the outside. So it has to turn into a two-sided war, a war internal to the state against internal enemies, a war of extermination against some of the very variations that help feed it, but especially against the variations that escape that whole reactive tendency, and an outward imperialist expansion where the state has to try to occupy all available space, because it's only if it occupies the totality of space that it can be a self-consistent totality. But that's impossible. There's always more space beyond the next border. So it becomes this completely untenable tension that becomes suicidal. In the 70s, Paul Virilio defined the fascist state as a suicide state. That whole dynamic I call fascism. And it's a sort of a pole of attraction that's imminent to all fascistizing tendencies, I think. But then there are modes of capture, what Deleuze calls the encastment of fascistizing tendencies in the state, which allows them to be channeled, sort of held in check to a certain amount to advance state aims within the bizarre rationality of a fascist state, resulting in a certain kind of authoritarian accommodation with microfascism. So all of that happens, it sort of goes back to the concept of elements in Langer. Langer says that these likes, these seeds of tendencies, seeds of activity that can grow into and take form, settle in as formed actions, they're always agitating a body, all bodies, the social field, body politic. And that there's always, that an element is never fully subsumed by any kind of overarching activity. A whole does not fully subsume the functioning of elements into itself, or the activity of elements, because the element's activity isn't reducible to function. It also includes that agitation, that attraction to other attractors, beginnings of other tendencies that resonate with tendencies not its own, that could form, sort of resolve into new tendencies. So there's an independence, a certain autonomy on the part of the elements that is part of this whole process-oriented way of thinking, where a whole is a correlation, a partial capture and correlation of the activity of elements toward the creation of overall integral effects. But that's an integration of differences that assumes a differentiation, and the differencing at the basis of the differentiation never stops. So there's no steady state in politics. There's no steady state even in the state, even though that's its ideal. So fascism is a dynamic, this dynamic sort of taken to an aggravated extreme in a certain direction, governed by reactive tendencies. And to talk about reactive tendencies, we probably have to get into the whole notion of error.
I guess I brought up error just in brief, but I only alluded to it. And so if you would like to continue that thread so that we could more deeply go into becoming reactionary.
So Whitehead has a really interesting theory of error. that also reoccurs in Suzanne Langer's work in really interesting ways. And for both of them, I don't know if they come out of Spinoza or if they simply connect back into Spinoza and his theories of error. So I try to sort of work between those two thinkers. And in all of them, error is not simply the lack of truth or something that is false. Error is truly embedded in perception and in the weave of the world. So it's objective in that sense. And it's built into perception. Whitehead uses an example that I develop a lot in the book, which is an example of the mirror, and just this a simple situation where in a state of somewhat inattention, you see something in the mirror and you try to touch it with your hand and you hit the mirror instead of getting the object. That was an error. I mean, it did not have a felicitous ending. It didn't take, your action didn't take on world. It was a mistake. But it was a mistake because the objective situation made that inevitable given your state of attention or intention. So you're part of the factor. It's not just objective in sense it was out there. It's the relational situation. So what all of the three thinkers says is that all perception has that built into it because it can't because there's certain tendencies, predispositions, habits that are sometimes false starts or lead to impasses. And it's just part of the way the world works, because to survive in the world, we have to form habits, and we form regularities in our behavior. We have predispositions that are ingrained in us. And error is one of the ways that expresses itself in the world. All of them say that the error never goes away. In Spinoza talks about different modes of knowledge that develop from it and deal with the error. But he insists the error is always there in trace at the kernel of thinking that is able to make itself into adequate ideas. So what he says is that the error is also an affective disposition, or I'm sort of working between the three. I'm not going to gloss Spinoza in a detailed way, but the idea is that the error has an affective disposition to it. You knock into the mirror and you blame the mirror. You're angry at the object. You misplace the causality by saying that the mirror made me do it, when it was actually your implication in that situation, along with perceptual structure of the situation that collectively led to that effect expressing itself through you. But you separate out the object and consider it blameworthy. You knock your toe against the table leg and you curse the table. Obviously, the table did not make you walk into itself, right? But it contributed. That kind of error, that's the kernel of reaction, where you're separating out an object, attributing a certain linear causality to its action, and then finding it in some blameworthy, at least in some proto-moral sense. And then the idea is that to overcome that, that's already happened. It's in your constitution. Langer says that errors are positive contributors to individuation in the person. You can't undo the fact that your perception was disposed in that way to make that error, and that error occurred. But what you can do is replace the error in a different kind of context. When Spinoza talks about common notions, he's not talking about properties that notions have in common, or notions that are common to different brains. Common notions are the way different kinds of elements enter into a relational field with each other, so that you can, if you turn your attention to thinking about the relation, you can expand your concept of causality past that simple linear causality into a kind of relational causality, understanding the active contribution of all of the elements as an expression of their own tendencies, their own powers. So instead of separating out and blaming, you're creating a relational context and starting to begin to understand the composition of bodies and the affective relationality. And that takes you into relation out of your reaction, your individual reaction, and the affective overtone of that. And it increases your sphere of potential action, because once you have the understanding of how bodies compose with each other, expressing their own powers together, but in that context, but maybe differently somewhere else, then you can start understanding about how to you encapsulate the error in that larger relational understanding, the linear causality within a nonlinear causality, a relational causality. And it doesn't take the trace of the error and the trace of that impingement and the sad affect that came with it never leaves, but it's wrapped in a different kind of take on the world that is becoming affirmative because it's allowing you to express your body, the body, to express its potentials more fully and not be limited by error. And then there's another stage, so it's common notion is the first level of adequate knowledge. And there are other stages, and the last stage is where that relational causality, we start being able to think about it not only in relation to the elements within a situation, but in situations in relation to each other, outside of any particular situation, inside the logic of their modes of composition and powers to be and to do and perceive and to affect. So that becomes another, like the level of the third level of knowledge that he calls intuition. So in a sense, thinking adequately is a developed power of error. It's not the opposite of error. It's not a truth as opposed to falsehood. It's all in terms of relational powers and how those can affirm what a body can do and affirm the affective range of a life so that its mode of existence becomes expanded from the point of view of its potentials. I apply that to racism, where the marker, for example, of black skin, there's a linear causality that is attributed to that there's attributed applying general ideas about race and other social groups. There's an idea of how a black person is that's triggered by this impingement of the perception of black skin. And an entire set of presuppositions move in linearly between that perception and the sets of effects it has in you. I use in the book some sociological studies of the radicalization process in women who participated in the white supremacy movement. And the conversion stories are always sort of a textbook case in this fundamental to perception error, the subjective illusion of a linear causality, and then attaching linear causality through the application of general ideas to a social category. So there's stories about, it was very strange that a number of the stories had to do with accidents, like someone having a car accident. They were already more or less racist, but they weren't actively racist in the sense of being involved in racist movements. They had in-laws who were black and where they were accepting of them. Then they had an accident in the car and they were very badly injured. And this is the work of Kathleen Blee. And then they wake up in the hospital and they're in pain. They don't know what has happened. Their existential foundation has been taken out from under them. They're in this extreme state of vulnerability in the sense that the world has just left from underneath their feet. And then they see black skin. And then immediately, in a kind of abduction, a kind of thinking feeling, they say black people are the cause of everything wrong in the world. The complete generalization and bringing in all of the stereotypes, all the categorical stereotypes about blacks. And then to fight the vulnerability, to fight the fact that the world doesn't always offer itself affordances for you that work for your well-being. All of that is channeled into hatred against blacks, and these people became white supremacist activists who ended up on death row through murderous attacks on African Americans. So that's all a kind of affective genealogy of racism that connects into racialist ideology. But the ideology isn't what converted them. The ideology is what was able to organize their conversion in a way that gave them a systematic outlet for their activity and gave them a thought overview way of thinking in general terms about what their orientation was. So I try to develop this idea of what the difference between adequate Spinoza's knowledge is versus objective illusion and the kinds of errors embedded by nature and perception, and then try to talk about what a becoming affirmative that is not at all sort of a happy-go-lucky attitude toward the world, because it's still based in error, it's still based in pain, even trauma that is never expungible, it's always there in traces, but can be enveloped in a larger field of thought so that those traces are not what are acting themselves out, but you're creating another set of traces, active traces that are unfolding into expression. So there's a becoming affirmative that I associate with anti-fascist thought, which is an attention to the event and the complex relational causalities of the event, rather than a reduction of it to linear causality and a recruitment of general notions.
I remember that very clearly, that your discussion of Blee, and it helped to concretize your mentioning, instead of focusing on ideology, you're proposing this investigation of corporeology. I'm not sure if that's your term or if you took that from another author, but it helped to clarify sort of what you meant by that, because you do contrast with certain other males who would claim ideology as the basis for how they became radicalized. But you also call into question whether or not we can sort of trust not just their first person narrative, but also if that's really how, as I would say, desire invests, how we unconsciously invest into those kind of things. You even suggest that perhaps part of the ornamental masculinity or whatnot is preventing them from acknowledging the source, the corporeal sources of that kind of imaginary isolating
or not,
prejudice. Sorry,
or not wanting to take the option of ornamental masculinity and trying to work with that more standard notion of male strength and imperviousness to emotions. But yeah, there's a limit to that genealogy I just went through, because not everyone has an accident and then becomes a racist activist. So the idea is that there's that, especially in the social in the digital world and social media world, there's just huge numbers of impinging images, words, and ideas that strike as if they were a wound, that destabilize, that come as insults or as in mass, creating a sense of vulnerability in the world, out of control and populated by an infinity of vague presences that are threatening in one way or another. So you don't have to have had an accident. You don't even have to ever have met a Jew or a Black. It's unlikely you would have met a Black, but a lot of the people from the states where these extreme militia groups come in have probably never met a Jew. But still, the same kind of genealogy of error happens through these micro shocks, through these impingements that are born in sort of carried in social media. And there's a connection into two things from there. One of them is conspiracy thinking, because that mass of vague impinging presences hit you stochastically, almost like an accident. And you have a certain reaction and need to create a linear causality, but they keep coming at you in such variety and such continuity that you don't really have the causal view to settle into one. It's just too diffuse to have that really simple kind of causality I talked about in the mirror example. So you have to go looking after the causality, and you're trying to create these linear causalities that lead to your insult and injury, but they're in such a variety that it becomes that one webs into another and into another and into another, and it becomes this endless associational web of malevolent actors that never ends proliferating, and that you can impose a category on, like your favorite other category to hate, But at the same time, it comes from so many directions and so many variants that's never enough. There's always a slide between who the enemy is and what capacity. The only way to stop that is to create a master enemy. And at one point, I quote a neo-Nazi saying, well, people just can't hold on to all of this complexity in what's happening, and there are too many enemies. So we have to find one enemy, and that's going to be the Jew. So we're going to go back to the anti-Semitic discourses that have been with us for centuries, and we're going to make the Jew the master key of the master figure of the enemy. And that leads to a certain kind of macro fascism and Nazism. But that's not the alternative that all people on that alt-right spectrum take. Many of them are sort of equal opportunity haters.
Instead of casual racism, it's competitive racism, as they say. I was thinking, just sort of as you were going through this, the notion, and I've said this before on the podcast, but it's one of the lines that has always stuck with me from The Logic of Sense, after he's discussed Bousquet's notion of the wound that pre-exists me, right? Deleuze mentions if there is an ethics of the event, it basically boils down to not to be unworthy of what happens to us. And I was thinking about this as you were discussing these notions of trauma and the associational webs that they weave, and how we can be sort of unworthy insofar as we separate out and isolate these in this becoming reactionary from the sort of situational complex. And this way of simplification is a way of sort of being unworthy of the event. It's to it's to fall back into a kind of, again, it's kind of like when Deleuze and Guattari say, as I said earlier, opinion helps to shield us away from the chaos, right? There is this, it gets back to this orthodox image of thought type of question, which I mentioned reading your book. I started to think about how your book, it feels like a meditation on noology, except obviously in a very expanded view, but in the sense in which Deleuze and Guattari kind of talk about these analyses of images of thought. Obviously that phrase would have to be expanded and complexified per your discussions in your concept creations. But that was one of the things that, I was kind of motivated by, where it is a kind of maybe a noological analysis of fascism and the promotion of anti-fascist tendencies.
And that notion of the wound is very central, which sort of connects to this term that Guattari uses in chiasmosis of the pathic, where there's a kind of receptivity that's deeper than any kind of passivity, where the body is constitutively open to impingements from the outside, and we're always being barraged by them. And in that opening to the outside, there's a moment of indecision of whether it's going to be sad or a joyful affect that comes with it, what the effect is going to have. There's a kind of destabilizing. And that pathic dimension underlies that whole genealogy of error that I talked about. But it's also something that can never be gotten rid of, because you need that radical openness to the outside in order to be responsive relationally to the world, so that it's not ever a question of healing in the sense of closing the wound, leaving a scar that allows you to ignore it. The wound is always to some extent open. It has to be enveloped in other dimensions that allow it to become an active, formative, potential affirming dynamic in your life. So a lot of the discourse around trauma I find very troubling, because it's really not giving the pathic its processual due.
Interesting. Yeah, it's there's that Nietzsche phrase that's always taken out of context, where it's what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, and it's always left out as the title of the aphorism, right? From Life's School of War, and we sort of have to. It's from Life's School of War. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. So it's a little bit more nuanced, but it does make me think about this notion of becoming active, of enveloping. Right, which, as you point out, is Spinoza's term, enveloping the that what happens to us into these relational modes that can compose with our bodies and increase our ability to act and to be acted upon, right? To affect and be affected.
Right. And maybe to end, I would just maybe end with a plea that was sort of the beginning also, is just a statement of how important it is not to drop the problematic of fascism. Fascism is a potential, always everywhere. It's always working through macro or micro political or both at the same time forms. It has, like all tendencies, it has a power of return. It's always the horizon, one of the horizons of our existence. And just I think there really needs to be really concerted anti-fascist thought that moves into anti-fascist action.
And as Guattari said, and everybody wants to be a fascist, it's always there, able to crystallize, right? So it's not something that can necessarily be done away with once and for all, as you just said.
Mm-hmm. No, and it takes left-wing as well as right-wing forms, in the sense that the dynamic of reaction has been very prominent in certain forms of left-wing movements. We see it in cancel culture, and we see it in certain uses of identity politics. And it's a danger that, once again, doesn't neatly fall into the left-right dichotomy, even though the right tries to make a virtue of it, whereas the left doesn't.
But you make a really good point, though, because online discourse can sometimes be reduced to fighting over National Socialism, and whether it's because it has the word socialism in it, it's left wing. And then you can show that it's beyond semantics and it's right wing. But Deleuze and Guattari themselves say, again, I think in the Micropolitics Plateau, that don't believe that the left wing won't be the last to secrete these microfascisms. For them, it is not merely, microfascisms aren't merely a right-wing thing, even if historically National Socialism can be most adequately, appropriately described as right-wing. That doesn't necessarily mean once and for all fascism is right-wing.
Exactly. Yeah. You need to shift to a different set of criteria that are processual criteria that have sort of a built-in orientation to them, because that polarity between affirmation and reaction, that polarizes a field that allows you to place tendencies within it, so that it's never simply an historical description of a actually existing empirical formation. If you do that, then you really can't, because there's so many differences between what happened in Italian fascism and in Nazism to what's happening today, as well as a lot of things that do connect. But you'll never be able to transfer any particular empirical model of an historical fascism onto what's happening now. You have to start over again with a new set of diagnostic tools and a logic that's powerful enough to undermine the logic of the general idea. That's what I call a logic of mutual inclusion.
Again, this is why I think it's helpful for me in my rereading. And as you said, this book will hopefully be on bookshelves by maybe next spring, perhaps in 2025. Yeah. So when I get a physical copy and I reread the printed version, I'm going to start with the postscript and then maybe check through the glossary to see which concepts I remember and how you rework them. And then I can start again. I think that'll be good food for thought. As a very last outro, we do want to give space always to our guests to mention anything that they are currently working on or what we can expect from them in the future. So if you have anything else you would like to, maybe you have some other projects that you've been working on, or you have a thought that you're kicking around that you might want to take up as a next work or a next essay or book, feel free to let us know and we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, there's writing projects. There's also life projects. There's I'm working with Aaron Manning in a network of collaborators around a project called the Three Ecologies Project, which is continuing the experimentation between art, philosophy, and activism that started more than 20 years ago with the Sense Lab and has now moved into a new iteration, taking up Guattari's concept of the three ecologies, the mental or subjective, the social and environmental. So we've created this land-based project that, in order to integrate the environmental directly into it. So we're working between the city and a very remote forest location at the end of the road in 3 hours north of Montreal, where we have no electricity, no connection to the electrical or other grids, live on solar energy. And we have solar houses in a cabin, and there's always an affordance for people, accommodation for people. The cabin is always free and open, and we have a stream of collaborators who come through and do their work in the forest environment, hopefully inflected by the issues of settler colonialism and climate change that we see around ourselves every day, but also connecting into the work of the three ecologies in terms of land regeneration. So it's a project, it's not a community, it's sort of what we call a platform for relation. And the overall orientation is to give the land back to itself. So it will become some form of collectively owned land trust that will be dedicated to experimental pedagogy and relation exploration that has a land-based component as well as a philosophical or artistic component. That's what I've been working on for the last 4 years with Aaron, alongside the writing. And in the writing, I guess the last thing I've written, I don't know when or if it'll come out, is about gender in ways that, I'm afraid could lead to cancellation very easily. But it's trying to talk about assemblages and speciation in the way I was talking about it before, the proliferation of one-of-a-kinds or of collective one-of-a-kinds.
The collective singular, right?
As opposed to, a collective singular, as opposed to a gender category. So it's sort of taking up the Deleuze and Guattari notion of non-human sex and putting a different spin on it, and talking about non-binary gender in ways that, in relation to certain orientations that I haven't actually seen discussed that. So anyway, that's done, but not out there yet.
That's very exciting. And I'm glad that you included a life project as well as the writing projects, because so often I have in mind asking about writing projects because that's usually what we discuss on here. But I'm glad that you brought that in and were able to tell us about that. So I think that's fascinating. And as I mentioned, we hope to see this book. I know you mentioned before, and you mentioned it during the show, reasons for why it's a little bit belated and forthcoming, but hopefully there aren't any other snags in the road to the final publication of your work that we discussed today.
I think it's smooth sailing from now on, and there shouldn't be any other snags. So it'd be nice to have it out in the world, so it's no longer on my plate.
Well, Brian, I appreciate your generosity, your patience, and also your patience with me pestering you for the past few years. I knew one day we would get to talk, and so I'm really glad that I got to meet you in the virtual flesh today, after many years of correspondence. And I appreciate your time and you sharing your ideas with us.
Thank you for your persistence, and thank you for the interest and the framing of the discussion in interesting ways.
Excellent. Well, Brian, we're going to stay on just so we can talk about our next episode, but we will let you get back to your Sunday afternoon. And just want to thank you again.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye, Brian.
Once again, thanks to Brian Massumi for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machine of Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.